Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone. Okay, so we're going to be recording. My name is Laura Colaneri. I'm the managing editor of Spanish and Portuguese Review, and welcome to our copy editing training. I'd like to introduce to you as well our managing editor for copy editing, Doaa Serag. Doaa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I hope you all are enjoying your summer so far. My name is Doaa Serag. I'm a PhD student in Temple University, and this is my 4th year. And this year, I'm the managing editor of SPR for the copy editing.
Okay, great. So first things first, I did want to just really quickly put in our volunteer interest form in the chat. Everyone can go ahead and check that out. If you have not yet filled it out, please fill it out for us. This is how we're going to be contacting people who have registered an interest in being copy editors for us this year. That would be associate editors of copy editing. If you've already filled this out as a peer reviewer and also marked that you were interested in copy editing, then you don't have to fill it out again. But if we've never heard from you and there's a couple of names I don't recognize, please be sure to fill that form out. The other thing I'm going to let you all know is I just want to apologize quickly if you hear any loud barking or other sounds of dogs in the background. I just got a puppy a couple of weeks ago, and so he and my older dog right now are being quiet, but they might come into the room and like jump around and fight a little bit. So bear with me on that end. So with all those preliminary things said, we're going to go ahead and give you a brief overview of SPR and the copy editing process. I'm going to hand things over to Doaa to go ahead and share the beginning of our presentation and provide you with a quick overview of Spanish and Portuguese Review.
So hello, everyone. In my part of this session, I'm going to go over 3 points. First of all, overview of Spanish and Portuguese, and then overview of the copy editing process and the associate editor job description. And lastly, review of SPR style guidelines and the citations and works cited formats. So for the overview of Spanish and Portuguese Review, what is Spanish and Portuguese Review? SPR, it's an annual graduate student journal for the American Association of Teachers in Spanish and Portuguese. It's a gold open access journal that is primarily disseminated online, and it supports as well the MLA statement on electronic publications. It's open, free for everybody. What are the types of publications in SPR? Publications in SPR are original, unpublished manuscripts, belongs to different fields of studies such as culture, film, linguistics, literature, pedagogy, second language acquisitions, translations, other areas related to the study or teaching of Hispanic and Luso-Brazilian languages and culture. We also have quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method of research, interviews, response articles, especially those who respond to articles published in SPRs, also books and tool reviews. Should I continue for the copy editing process? Okay. So the second point is an overview of SPR's copy editing process and associate editor job description. What is the role of an associate editor? It's an entry-level publishing professionals who assist in various prior to print editing process. We can summarize the process of copy editing in 6 steps. An associate editor at the beginning should attend training, learn copy editing procedures by reading checklists and documents provided to them by the manager editor. The second step is that they receive by email the article that they should revise in a Word document, along with the author's letter and tab of revisions. The third step is that they have to compare the tab and letter to finished work, so they ensure that the author completed all the revisions as expected. The fourth one, they need to use the production checklist to add any comments that they see necessarily and track changes in Word and communicate questions with problems with the manager editor. The fourth step is that they send back to the manager editor within 3 weeks of receipt of the paper. The last one is that they proofread the typist pages and proven in addition to the author. The SPR style guidelines, I think.
Thanks for that, Doaa.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're just going to skip around a little bit now that Doaa has reviewed the general timeline at Spanish and Portuguese review for what the Associate Editor of Copy Editing does. We're going to talk a little bit more widely about what copy editing is and what the sort of skills are that a copy editor should be utilizing and thinking about when editing a manuscript. And then we'll go back to Doaa to talk a little bit about our specific style guidelines here at SPR. 1 second, I'm just going to share my own PowerPoint presentation and view slideshow. Great. So copy editing, I'm starting with like very much the basics because I think that sometimes there can be some misunderstandings about the meanings of the words that we use in the publishing process. Copy editing is a stage that happens after the first major revisions done by the author. So we've already at this point had peer reviewers read through and provide substantive feedback on the content largely of the article, sometimes other things about the structure or the organization, etc. So you'll often hear the words copy editing and proofreading thrown around, sometimes interchangeably. You might be hearing, hearing the phrase like, oh, I just have to proofread my paper real quick before sending it to my professor. That's sort of used to mean what we actually use the word copy editing for. So copy editing is largely correcting issues of spelling, grammar, and style, improving readability. That includes working on the structure, the logical flow, the clarity, ensuring accuracy, noting and correcting any incorrect or unclear information or information that might be in doubt, right? And so this is going to be largely reviewing a manuscript that's still a Word document, right? So in publishing, generally, when we use the word proofreading, what we're actually talking about is looking at a manuscript that has already been laid out into pages. So proofreading is when, the copy editor has already tried to catch all those major issues. And when you get those laid out PDF pages, you're just trying to correct any major errors, major typos, and formatting issues. So those are actually two separate stages. Copy editing is going to happen before the article goes into what we call production. Proofreading is going to happen when the article is in production, when it's being put into these typeset pages. So those are actually two different steps, but a copy editor, at least here at SPR, is going to be called upon to largely do their work when the manuscript is in this Word document format, doing major corrections, right? And then trying to get everything out of the way, and then proofreading is just going to be a final review. So we will send that back to the author for their final review. So they're meant to catch those typos that might have been in there or any formatting issues. But we also usually have our copy editors just take a quick final look at it as well. Now, what makes a well-written article? I do want to caveat this with the idea that, audiences have different expectations for what they want out of a journal article, right? So when I'm talking about this, largely I'm going to be talking about a North American academic style, but there are certainly differences between that and the European and particularly the Latin American academies. So you want to be aware of your audience. So here it's not, we are a North American publication or a US publication. We do want to largely follow those expectations, but that doesn't mean that people with different academic backgrounds, particularly, from Latin America or France, you might have a different way of approaching an article, and that's going to be okay too. We're not trying to completely get rid of an author's voice here, but we do want to sometimes be helping out with meeting these expectations for our particular audience, right? There are going to be notable exceptions, obviously. Notice, when we're writing an article, a graduate student is writing an article, we're really not trying to write like Derrida, right? His article, his articles, chapters, and speeches, they're much less direct. They don't articulate this argument earlier. They're bringing the reader on a journey. You know, most of us are not going to be functionally writing like that at this stage of our careers, but that doesn't mean that we should get rid of a structure that is working for an article. So with that caveat in mind, a lot of North American expectations are that we want a clear articulation of the argument early on. We want a brief introduction or summary of any relevant context that's historical or cultural, that's providing a summary of your primary text. And that's really about having an awareness of what an audience can be expected to know or what might need to be explained to them, right? The article should have an organization that reiterates and is explicit about each section's relevance to that argument without also being redundant, right? So you want to have paragraphs and sections that build upon one another in a logical, organic way. And you want to have certain transition phrases or statements, often this is also called signposting, that help make that organization clear to the reader, right? So, you know, that might include something as explicit as, in this section, I did X. In the following section, I will do X, right? So that's a very explicit way of putting it, or there's more subtle ways of putting it, right? So you want to be, you know, making those sort of signposts for the reader without being hugely redundant. So you're going to keep an eye out for whether an article might need some of those things inserted. The article should obviously engage with the scholarly literature, but in a particular way, right? So they need to talk about its relevance, whether the author agrees with it, is building upon it, or is actually disagreeing with it or using it as a counterexample. They want to be explicit about why they're using particular forms of evidence in the scholarly literature, and also paraphrase and interpret it, not just provide sort of a series of quotes. So minimize those very lengthy quotes via paraphrase, or only include them if they're really, really worth it. And then they need to address the sort of what we call the so what question, right? Which is the wider implications of the argument. Why should the reader care about this article, right? Finally, there should be the use of clear language and logical sentence structures. And that is going to depend upon, again, the language with which it is written, right? So a logical sentence structure and clear language in English is not necessarily the same as in Spanish, right? So these are all things for a copy editor to keep in mind when they're reviewing a manuscript, right? You know, when they're saying, you know, this is how I can improve this article, you might help, you know, you might make a note like, oh, this needs a little bit more context here, or, you know, this, you know, insert some transition statements to make that signposting more clear, rewrite some of those sentence structures, right? So this discussion sort of brings me to two types of copy editing that we might engage in here at SPR, right? The first one is macro editing, or what's often referred to as macro editing. So that's the big picture stuff. You might also see it referred to as developmental or substantive editing. This is by and large going to be the more complex editing, right? And it's going to take up a lot more time. So at this stage, most of this should really have been done during the peer review process. And so what you should be doing is assessing how well the author has addressed these reviewers' comments and whether there are still some revisions that need to be made in terms of the paper as a whole. So this sort of macro editing could include, how does the overall organization or structure of the article support the articulation and explication of the argument? Is there another form of organization of the sections or paragraphs that might be a little bit more logical? So you might, you know, take a whole paragraph and be like, this paragraph doesn't belong here. It belongs 2 paragraphs down, because here you make the argument and here you present the evidence, right? For example, right? Are there whole sentences or paragraphs or sections that are actually redundant, that could be more concise, that could be shortened, or that could be completely cut out? Does the article need more or even fewer transition statements or signposting? I know that sometimes in my writing process, I put a lot of signposting in there that's actually meant to help me, you know, so that I'm saying, in this article, I will argue, you know, and then I go back and I actually delete a lot of that signposting because it's actually unnecessary, and it's really about clarifying to me my writing process rather than clarifying to the reader the argument, right? Another question of macro editing might be, does the argument and its implications or significance need to be more clearly articulated? You know, are you reading it and still going, you know, so what? You know, explain to me why I should care about this, to put it in the harshest terms. Does the article need more use of paraphrase, right, to reduce the amount of time dedicated to other people's words, or more explicit interpretation and articulation of the relevance of evidence? This is another problem I know I have a lot in my writing. I have to stick a long quote there, and I have to go back and say, I can summarize this quote via paraphrase and be explicit about why it's important, rather than spending so much time on somebody else's words, right? So these are the macro editing questions, and you always want to address these big questions during your maybe your second read through, right? So your first read through will be, okay, this article did address the peer reviewer's comments, and then maybe your second read through will say, oh, okay, these are sort of the big picture issues that I can help them address by recommending they move one thing to another thing, and a lot of this can be done through comments on the Word document, or if you have a very particular, idea for rephrasing, you can do the, track changes line edits. We're going to be doing track changes for everything, right? The second type of editing is micro editing. You might hear of it referred to as line editing or mechanical editing. This is about the details, right? The little things. So you're looking at structures, phrases, words, addressing errors in spelling, in grammar, or in style for these. And that's going to be really about, doing the sort of like nitty gritty, right? So here's a little bit of advice that I'm actually using from Wendy Laura Belcher's book, which is called Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks. If you have not read this, I actually highly recommend it for if you are working on your own revision process for getting published. For the first time or the second time, I'm using it for my second article anyway, because it really helps organize a little bit. So this is she includes a whole week talking about sort of the micro editing, which is, love Belcher's book. Thank you for that, Andrea. Oopsie, sorry. So when she talks about micro editing, she has certain recommendations, and this is for English, right? But you as speakers of Spanish or Portuguese, can also have a good idea of how to improve clarity of language and sentence structures, right? So she says something, don't use two words when one will do. Often I have a problem, for example, where I won't be sure of which noun I want to use. So I'll say two synonyms, and I'll say it's this and this, right? And instead I should be really picking one word that is more meaningful. Don't use a noun when you can use a verb. So in general English, you can often use a noun, a nounified, a nominized version of a verb, and the verb is going to be more stronger, more clear, and shorter, right? Minimize adjectives and adverbs. So you can often use a stronger verb rather than a weak verb plus an adverb. Don't use a pronoun when a noun would be clearer. That's about making sure the subject or object of your sentence is clear. Don't use a general word when you can use a specific one. Don't use the passive voice unless the subject is unknown or unimportant. Again, this is English language rules. Does not necessarily apply to Spanish and Portuguese, where the passive voice is much more common and acceptable. Eliminate redundant in-sentence lists. That's another thing I do. Instead of using one strong word, I will say this, and this, and then I'll look at it again. I'll be like, this is all redundant, right? They all mean essentially the same thing. I just couldn't decide which word I wanted to use. And then shorten complex sentence. So try breaking them into multiple sentences, even stuff that's not technically a run-on sentence. I think as academics, we have a tendency to do that. But if you find you're putting multiple, semicolons or dashes and colons all in the same sentence, it might be that you need to break that sentence up, right? So this is Belcher's really helpful micro editing advice. And a lot of this stuff is actually online. If you don't manage to get the book, but the book is in a lot of people's libraries, and her own website also has a lot of resources. The other thing I do want to mention when we are talking about this micro editing and macro editing, but mostly the micro editing is, we don't want to completely erase the author's voice. We're all individuals, right? So maybe you'll personally read a sentence and you'll be like, I would have phrased this a different way. As long as the meaning is clear, you don't necessarily have to change that phrasing, right? You want to be considerate about what is a good reason to change an author's words and what isn't necessarily a good reason, right? And personal preference, personal style, it doesn't really translate. But when we're talking about, you know, clarity, that sort of thing, definitely you can do that, right? So here's a brief note on what I mean by spelling or grammar and style, right? Spelling and grammar, they're pretty much basics. They're considered to be somewhat inflexible rules, right? That's, you know, very much a simplification of the issue, right? But we have things like words that only have one acceptable spelling, right? It's either right or it's wrong. Subject-verb agreement, use of consistent tenses, use of correct conjugations, all those things are pretty much inflexible, right? There's one way to do them. But when we talk about style, part of that is recognizing that in spelling and grammar, there are actually often multiple correct options, right? And that when we make a choice about it, it's not about being right or wrong. It's a style choice for the purpose of consistency, right? That things should always be the same within an article, within a particular journal, right? So for example, the US American English style is going to be different from the British English style, favor versus favor. Those are spelled completely differently. Both of them are correct, but because we're a US American publication, we're going to be using the US American style in SPR, right? Next one would be the MLA style versus, for example, the Chicago style, the AP style, or the APA style, et cetera, right? So in MLA style, the title of a novel, 2666, is going to be italicized, but in AP, which is Associated Press style, which is used for newspapers, they'll put quotes around the title of a longer publication. And then there's something we call the house style. So that's something that we just make a decision about for the sake of consistency within the journal. So the example I put is spelling, grammar, and style using the serial comma, which is the comma that goes before and, or spelling, grammar, and style without the serial comma. We here at SPR use the serial comma. That's largely because I prefer it, right? And that's just it, you know, that's what that style choice comes down to. We just make the decision in order to keep it consistent. But again, we're keeping that consistent within languages. So in English, this is a style issue that is flexible. In Spanish, it's not. We don't use a serial comma in Spanish, or at least I have never heard of us using it in Spanish, right? So those are differences of language as well, which we have to keep in mind, right? So some common grammar and style issues we're going to face in, you know, things all the time is going to be subject and verb agreement. Native speakers of languages make mistakes where subjects and verbs don't agree all the time, right? Very common, not a big deal, right? When we're correcting grammar and style or spelling, it's not about people's intelligence level, you know, it's not about people's education level. It's about the fact that we are all human beings who do things incorrectly sometimes and don't even notice it, right? And when somebody else looks at our writing, often they're going to notice it before we are, even if they're the kind of person who makes the exact same mistake in their own writing, right? Use of the serial comma, it's also called the Oxford comma. That's going to be something you'll see frequently because people do it according to their own style all the time, right? Their own preference. And so we're just going to be, as copy editors, correcting that so that it's consistent within their article and across all of our articles. Hyphens, N dashes, and M dashes. As a brief explanation, a hyphen is the shortest one, an N dash is the next largest, and an M dash is the largest one, right? So a hyphen is often used to connect two words that are sort of like meant to go together, right? An N dash is used less often, but it's used sometimes between dates, right? That sort of thing. And then an M dash is usually the sort of thing that we use almost interchangeably with parentheses, at least in English, to set one part of the sentence off from another part of the sentence, or sometimes in English we'll actually use it like a comma, right? And so the reason I bring this up right now is that this is a style issue that we see very frequently in Spanish and Portuguese review because it's not often talked about that the way those are inserted are different in each language, right? So in English and Portuguese, at least in the US American style, when we use an M dash, it's going to be flush with the text. And in English, there does not need to be a closing M dash. You can use one just at the end of a sentence to set the end of the sentence apart. and you don't need to insert one again, you know, before the period, right? But in Spanish, the cases that you do need to have a starting and an ending em dash, just like a parentheses always has to have a to in English. And there will be a space before the em dash, then it will be flush with the text, and then there will be a space after the closing em dash, right? You can look up many examples of that. I believe we have some examples in our copy editing checklists that you will be able to see. Another style issue is no double spaces at the end of sentences. This is something that there's like a huge amount of debate about, right? Because many people were taught that you were supposed to put 2 spaces at the end of after a period. That was actually a leftover of print culture and is no longer necessary with computer word processing and the way we do printing now. So basically, one of the first things I encourage you to do when you get a manuscript is just to Control F, Control Find to search for 2 spaces and replace them with 1 space. Language that's unintentionally sexist, heteronormative, ableist, right? You might run into that a little bit. You know, we do advocate for, instead of using, you know, sort of his or he to refer to an unknown subject, you use the neutral they or their. Or at the very least his or her, which I find to be a little bit more clunky than going with they or their. There's other examples I could go through that I won't, you know, but there's things like, you know, common expressions that can be sort of ableist, right? So an expression that might say they were blind to the fact that, you want to try and correct that because that's actually ableist language that we sort of have naturalized in US American English. So you could change it to they were ignorant of, or they were unaware that, right? Capitalizations, that's another one that's an issue very often because it is different in English and Spanish and Portuguese, right? So capitalizations for proper names of ethnic groups, right, is also sort of a thing that is, it's actually a political choice in English, US English, to capitalize Black, to capitalize Indigenous, but not to capitalize white, because white is, there's a whole white supremacist background of, you know, there's whole reasonings behind it, which I won't get into, but which I do encourage you to look up to think about how our language is political, right? Words and titles, so the difference between an MLA versus APA standard. If you are coming from a linguistics or education background, you might be used to using APA, in which case you would only capitalize the first letter of a title, but in MLA we do capitalize all, everything except for articles, usually. So we follow those rules. And then obviously in English, we capitalize everything, but if you're writing in Spanish or Portuguese, or if you have a, if you are referring to a book that's in Spanish or Portuguese, even if you're writing in English, then you would only use the initial caps, right? So that's the first letter. And then after colons, right? So in English, you do, capitalize the first word after a colon. Remind me, I don't remember what's the case in Spanish or Portuguese, but I know that it's different, right? I think that after a colon, maybe in Spanish, it's yes, it is initial caps. In Portuguese, it's lowercase. That's something I encourage you all to be aware of the background of. Probably there's people who are better. I always have to Google it every time I double check. But I usually try to make a note of those potential issues so that I can double check them afterwards. And then obviously we have differences in language where, you know, a nationality is capitalized in English when it's used as an adjective, but not in Spanish. Mujer italiana without the mayúscula versus Italian woman, where Italian does have a mayúscula, right? Yeah, and again, you know, I just wanted to emphasize the style distinctions between languages. Capitalization of titles, capitalization of proper adjectives, the placement and spacing of em dashes, right? The location of punctuation, whether it will be inside or outside. I didn't mean to say parentheses there, that should say quotations, right? So when you have quotations in English, you would put the punctuation inside the parentheses to end the sentence, whether that's a comma or a period. as opposed to in Spanish, you would put the period in this sentence outside of the comillas, right? Okay. So moving on, and we'll get back to Doaa in just a few minutes. We put my section right in the middle so I could just talk and talk and talk. I wanted to review really quickly the Spanish and Portuguese reviews, copy editing, and pre-production checklist. So a lot of the information that I've covered can be a little bit overwhelming, but all of these things are covered here, right? And also in our author guidelines, which Doaa is going to talk about a little bit more. So we provide this checklist along with the article manuscript. It's important to review this closely as a copy editor because it's going to have the two checklists that are going to be relevant for you. The first one is going to be titled the copy editing checklist and then the pre-production checklist, and I'll show you these in a minute. So by copy editing, I mean both that macro and micro work that you're doing. And then pre-production is basically double checking all formatting before we're going to approve sending this back to the author and putting this into production with our production editors, right? You're going to use track changes and the comment function to make your changes because we're going to want to be able to have the author to review them and approve any changes. You're going to want to compare everything with the MLA and SPR style guidelines to make sure that we're following those. So anytime you have a question, you're like, oh, is this the correct way for us to put, you know, this particular style thing? Let me go double check the MLA guidelines to see what they say and the SPR guidelines, right? And Doaa is going to talk about those in just a minute. And then I'll take care of this last piece after I show you the checklist really quickly. Okay, are you seeing this on my screen share? The checklist just came up? Great. So at the beginning, we've got our copy editing checklist, right? So after revisions have been completed, we check things for the, you know, it explains to you exactly what to do, right? Download the file so you can use the track changes, review the response to reviewers, right? That you've also been provided in the email. And then you, once you're satisfied with that sort of macro question, you move on to the particular copy editing issues. So looking closely at the language, you'll see it says spelling and grammar, informal language, contractions, non-academic languages, awkward sentences, unintentionally sexist or, you know, heteronormative, ableist, etc., flagging anything that's repetitive and redundant, talk about suggestions on how to rephrase things, checking the title, the abstract to make sure those are both quality and they make sense for the article, and making any recommendations for changes, and then check that the author is actually using MLA writing and style conventions, right? So again, this would often be things about in-text citations. We do have a slightly different way of doing those for straight literature articles versus linguistics and pedagogy, which is outlined in our author guidelines, and which I think Doaa is going to mention, if I recall correctly. But we can cover it at the end if you don't mention it, Doaa. So all this is all, you know, the things you want to be sure of for copy editing, right? So all that stuff I've sort of just summarized for you about what a copy editor does. Then at the end, once you've finished that, we have this pre-production checklist. So after copy editing, but before you send these articles to be typeset or laid out, the editors need to check for this, the essentials, right? That we actually have the title, the name, the affiliation, the abstract, and keywords, right? Because sometimes, you know, you won't be thinking about it and you'll be like, oh, right, where is the abstract, right? It'll be in a separate document somewhere. Formatting, so dashes and hyphens being correct, double spaces, the text is single space without spaces between paragraphs. And I'm actually going to quickly switch where my screen share is to show you what I mean by that. Are you seeing a Microsoft Word document I just opened? Okay, great. Here's just like 2 sentences, right? So you may or may not be familiar with this word function, right? So up here on the bar, you've got this little paragraph symbol, right? And so the point of this is to show or hide basically formatting. So you click the button and you'll see here, it'll say, oh, here's a paragraph, right? And so all of these things will show up, these sort of hidden formatting issues. So when you sometimes click tab to begin your paragraph, you'll see that this little arrow shows up. We shouldn't have that little arrow, right? It should actually be gotten rid of so that it's just a written in this way, right? Because this paragraph is going to indicate to me that the next one is going to be indented, right? So often, you know, this will sometimes be auto-corrected like it just was by Microsoft Word, or sometimes there will be like this little arrow in there. So you're going through, you're making sure to fix that. You'll also see these little dots that shows you how many spaces there are. So that can help you notice if there's 2 spaces at the end. So if you're looking at it and you're like, oh, I'm not sure, is that 2 spaces? Let me just show the hidden formatting and then I can check that, right? So that's basically what you need the hidden formatting for. And the reason that this is important is because when we go through production and we put these things into our design software, if there's like a stray tab or a weird space or weird formatting issue, it will show up and we have to correct it. And it's harder to correct it in that design software than to just when we upload it this way. Yes. Let's see. I have you don't see a Word doc, only a Google Doc. Oh, okay. So the Word doc didn't come up for you, Angela or Isabella. Let me stop my share and bring it back up. And then I can cover that really quickly. So here we go. Now you can see that I'm like, yeah, yes, you see it. Okay, great. So the relevant thing that I was just showing you is you click this button right up here to show hidden formatting symbols, right? So this paragraph symbol at the end means that a new paragraph has started at the final line. You'll see that here things are indented with, and it's just blank. That's correct. But you'll see that here it's indented with this arrow. So that's a tab that has been inserted into the formatting of Microsoft Word, right? And so when we go to put that into the InDesign software, as copy editors, you want to review that so you can get rid of it. And Microsoft Word, often if you click the tab button on your computer when you're typing, depending on your settings, it should insert, you know, just auto correct it so that it's right. And it'll get rid of that little formatting symbol so that it doesn't mess with our stuff. Oh yeah, I'll thank you for that. I recommend the shortcut for this, which is Control-Shift+8, right? And then the other things you can see here are if I add 2 spaces, you'll see that the spaces are symbolized by these little dots. So you can notice if things have been double spaced, it'll be made more clear when you click this button, right? I find that to be very helpful. Okay. I'm just going to switch back to my screen here, which was the copy editing and pre-production checklist to continue here. So other things you'll want to do is, yeah, so you want to make sure this text is single spaced, no spaces between paragraphs. New paragraphs are indented but don't have the tabs at the beginning of them using that symbol. Then we have that subheadings and subheadings are consistent both within the document and with our guidelines, right? And so a heading, you know, you'll want to follow the MLA guidelines for that, you know, whether it's supposed to be flush left or centered, or whether it's supposed to be in Roman is what we call it when it's a regular font like this, or italicized or bold or whatever. Bulleted or numbered lists should be consistent within the document and with our guidelines. So don't, you know, this is a big pet peeve of mine when they have a numbered list, but then, you know, so it's like 1, 2, 3, all on separate lines. And then later they'll have, you know, a bulleted list, right? Just, you know, be consistent, right? There's no reason to have, you know, if there's no reason why they're different, then it sort of doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And then you want to make sure you review the tables, that they're correct, that they're formatted right, that they're clear, that they're consistent, right? Because sometimes people will create their own tables and you'll look at it. Sometimes you'll look at it and you'll be like, this information is conveyed accurately in your paragraph. It doesn't even need to be in a table, right? Other times you'll look at it and you'll be like, oh, okay, this table is necessary, but you know, it's not following the correct format. So like here, you've got like bolded headings on the top of your columns, and then everything is like, you know, but there's bolds in between and it's all over the place. You want it to be consistent, right? Those are usually, you know, tables usually appear in our linguistic articles, right? Citations. Works cited entries need to be consistent and not missing any information. As a copy editor, you do have to look at the works cited very closely to make sure that everything's correct. They're not missing important parts of the citation, that there's not extra spaces or tabs or paragraph breaks in them, again, using that formatting symbol, that they're accurate with our guidelines. And again, our guidelines are linked here so you can review them. They're on our website here under the submission guidelines. So if you scroll down, you can see what they're supposed to look like, right? And this is the discussion of the in-text citations, et cetera, right? And it links also to our guide on MLA style, which Doaa is going to talk about a little bit later. Make sure that footnotes have been reviewed, that they are correct. But you know, if you see a footnote and you're like, this footnote doesn't need to be here because it is redundant, it's just repeating the text, or it's just a citation, make that an in-text citation or eliminate it if it doesn't need to be there, or if it could be in the body text. We want to minimize the footnotes. And then the final important thing at this stage is images, right? So if the author has images, we need to, this is probably going to be something that really Doaa is going to be taking care of, since I don't know that, you know, I think usually our manuscripts will send the images to you as well, right? But there should be references to any images in the text. They should be checked so that none of them are repeated and there aren't any missing numbers, right? So maybe they'll say like, see figure 2, and then the next thing they say is see figure 4. A lot of times that means they deleted a figure and they forgot to renumber them. So you're going to want to flag those sorts of things as well. Okay, so I'm just going back to my PowerPoint. You know, I think that I have established pretty well what I mean by the hidden formatting, and then the Control F is the search function, at least, you know, using Windows and Microsoft Word to be able to, you know, if you realize that every single time somebody spelled a name, they forgot, for example, on Perón, they forgot the diacritical mark over the O, you can Control F for Perón to replace all of those mistakes at once. So if you're finding consistent mistakes throughout, like in spelling and that sort of thing, you can always use Control F to make things easier for you so you know that you're not forgetting anything. But do be careful using that function, because if you replace Perón, you might also replace all instances of Peronism with an O over the, or with an accent over the O, which would not be correct. So if you're doing that, make sure you know, you put spaces at the end, right? So it's Perón space, replaced with Perón spelled correctly with a space, right? That's all for me. I am going to go ahead back to Doaa before we actually go to questions, and she's got some more information we're going to cover really quickly.
Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So for SPR style guidelines, we need to make sure one of the most important role of the associate editor is to make sure that the basic submission reminders are all completed as expected in the paper that they are revising. So for example, that the author did not use all caps for titles, that the article is a single space, the Times New Roman font size 12 is used, did not include macros, section breaks, or text boxes in the document, that based on the guideline in MLA, the author did use italics instead of underlining. They used only one space after all punctuation. They used the left justification for all manuscripts. They used automatic footnotes, not endnotes. They included any accompanying images. As Laura said, it should be in the highest resolution possible as separate files along with the original submissions. Of course, for both actually literature and linguistics papers. But these are the basic general submission reminders that sometimes the author forgets about, and as an associate editor, you need to make sure that these submission reminders are completed. As for the style and formatting, in SPR, we use the most current MLA style for all articles. And I'm going to share with you later this link that whenever you have a doubt, you're not sure about a specific citation in text citation or in works cited, if it's cited correctly or not, you can always check this link to make sure that they are all cited accordingly to the most current MLA style for all articles. So now I'm gonna walk you through the list of core elements. We have 9 elements as MLA. Per the MLA instructions, there are 9 core elements that the author need to follow while citing any reference that he mentioned in his text. So the author, title of source, title of container, other contributors, version, number, publisher, publication date, and finally the location. So for the author, as we all know, the author's last name followed by a comma and the rest of the name as presented in the work, and they have to end this element with a period, as we can see in this example. The title of the source should follow the author's name, of course, but we have 2 types. And depending on the title of the source, it could be italics or in quotation marks. So we have different types of title of the source. For example, if it's a book, then it should be in italics, as we can see in this example. If it's a web page, an individual web page, it should be in quotation marks. And the name of the parent website, which in MLA, it treats it as a container. It should be in italics, as we can see in this example as well. If the title source is periodical, like a journal, like magazine, newspapers, it should be in quotation marks as well. If there are other contributors that like editors, illustrators, translators, that they are relevant to the research, then they must be identified in the source, and their names must be included in the documentation. Like if it's a translation, for example, it should be like translated by, annotated, and with an introduction by, and then we mention the name of the person who translated or who added the annotated introduction. What if the title of, now we are in the version. As we can see here, if a source is listed as an edition or version of a work, then you have to include it in the citation, as we see in these 2 examples. For example, for the Bible of, in the second example, if it's a first edition, second edition, third edition, all these information must be mentioned in the citation. What about the number? The source is part of a numbered sequence. If it is a part of a sequence, a numbered sequence, like a multi-volume book or journal with both volume and issue numbers, then they also must be cited in the citation, as we can see in this example, volume 6, number 2. So what about the publisher? What about if we have more than one publisher? So as we can see here, so I can see the screen, the publisher produces or distributes the source to the public. If there's more than one publisher and they are all relevant to the research, then the author must list them in the citation separated by a forward slash. The publication date is critical also to mention, but what if we have more than a publication date? In this case, it is sufficient to use the date that is most relevant to the writing. But if you are not sure about which date to use, then you have to, or the author must mention the date with the source's original publication. So as I mentioned, for detailed explanation of the 9 core elements and additional elements and any doubt or concern that you have regarding the citation that the author followed in his article, this is the website that you should consult all the time. So we have also common additional style concerns and capitalization, and I think that Laura already covered all of them. So I'm gonna quickly go over them. So manuscripts should follow the capitalization rules of the language in which they are written. If it's Spanish, then based on the language of the article. In Spanish, we follow the capitalization rules of Spanish, Portuguese, English, and so on. So foreign words within an English title should be capitalized, like the importance of teaching ser and estar. Subtitles should be introduced in all cases with a colon, and the first word of the subtitle should be capitalized for all languages. Revolución cubana, historia, conflictos y desafíos. So the author should not capitalize parts of a book, and they should capitalize references to sections like tables within an article and so on. What the author should avoid and should not avoid. The author should avoid the use of abbreviated names, should not use initial in place of titles, should avoid the use of abbreviations in titles and abstracts like second language acquisition, foreign languages. They should introduce always the complete word or phrase before using the abbreviation. First mention it, the complete word or phrase. They never should start sentence with an abbreviation. Second language production is essential, but second language production is essential. So abbreviate only United States when it is used as an adjective, in which cases the abbreviation should not use periods, as the examples that we can see in here. Punctuation and the theoretical marks. We have these general reminders as well that you, and all of these are mentioned in the website of SPR that you might need to check while revising a paper. Like all articles in Spanish must confirm the latest standards of La Real Academia Española, including the elimination of the diacritic accent from solo and demonstrative pronouns. Articles in Portuguese must confirm the novo acordo ortográfico, use the serial comma. In English, I think Laura did like a very good job explaining to all of us the differences. Punctuation should go inside the quotation marks in articles in English. All punctuation that does not pertain to the quotation itself should go outside the quotation marks in articles in Spanish and in Portuguese. We have to make sure that they include accents or other diacritical marks on capital letters in Spanish and Portuguese. For linguistic articles, speech samples can include translation and should be set off with single quotation marks, as you can see in this example. So for the ellipsis, for words omitted by the author, use 3 periods, each separated by a space, and do not include final punctuation for sentences. And don't use brackets. For ellipses in original text, use 3 periods without intervening space. For names of people, we should avoid the use of titles with names such as professor, prof, and so on. When referring to an author for the first time within a literature article, the author should use the complete name, including the middle initials, and use subsequent references should use the last name only. So they should use both the parent, paternal and maternal last names when provided in Spanish and Portuguese. As for the linguistic and pedagogy articles, the modified citation styles require the use of last name only in all cases. And as I said, I'm gonna share with you the the link where you can find these all these guidelines explained in details in case you have any other question or concerns. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Doaa. So the one thing I forgot to mention and that we sort of missed between ourselves was the citational differences between our literature and linguistics articles. And I'm going to just enter into the chat the words, the phrasing from our website. And Doaa is actually going to send you the link to all of the author guidelines that she just covered, which is also on our website. But when you're working on a linguistics article, we do slightly modify the MLA citation, and that basically is to include the year of the publication, right? So an in-text citation would be, say, Schmidt 1996 notes, 20, and then 23, which is the page number, or Schmidt 1996:23 would be another way of doing it if you're doing it without referring explicitly to the author. And then when you're in the work cited, you're going to include the year in parentheses directly after the author's name. So it'd be Schmidt Donald, period, 1996 in parentheses, period, and then you would continue with the rest of the citation. So unlike the MLA, which puts the year at the end, right? And so that's the modified style that España, which is our sister journal, uses. And so that's the style that we use. So again, we've got the Purdue OWL for you to be able to access if you have any questions while you are working on these, when you're talking about MLA style. And then we have the other link in the chat, which is to our website for our author guidelines. And that is going to outline any of our particular style issues, including things for our book and tool reviews, which you may also be working on, right? But if you scroll down to the end of this, past the book and tool reviews, past the interviews, past some of our other stuff, this is like a lot of information on it. It'll talk about our other common additional style concerns, which are all of the things that Doaa just covered here. So this is like a lot of information for everyone. Remember, we don't expect you to necessarily have all of this memorized. It is important to have these reference tools available. Also because, the MLA style that you may have sort of internalized while writing papers at this point might be slightly out of date, right? They've made some decisions that change what those containers look like. And we are using the 9th edition, actually. I think it might still say 8th edition on the website, but we use the most recent edition. So all of that is accessible through Purdue OWL if you're not familiar with it. If you want a refresher, you can always compare while you're working, right? So we have taken up most of our time, but we are ready to take any questions if anyone wants to put questions in the chat or pose them to either of us directly. Okay, well, I'm not hearing any questions or seeing any questions in the chat. Give me one sec. I'm going to again reiterate for anybody who might have missed the first couple of minutes of this, that if you are interested in helping us out as a copy editor, we do want you to fill out this volunteer interest form that I just put in the chat. If you've already filled this out during our peer review process, that's fine. So you don't have to fill it out again, but if you've never filled out a form for us, please do so. We just got a question from Angela that is, do editors review articles in our research area, or could they be from any area, i.e. linguistics versus literatures and cultures? Doaa, do you want to answer that?
Well, I would say that while filling the form of volunteering form, we take that into consideration, because when you fill the form, you mention what your specialty is. So we take that into consideration, because it is best that like a linguistic person to review a linguistic paper, and a literature or culture or disability studies and so on. So we take that, of course, into consideration based on the information that you provided to us while completing the form.
Thanks, Doaa. Yeah, and it's, it might not be your exact research area because it's slightly less important than during the peer review process. So you don't have to be necessarily an expert on it. For example, I could probably, I studied 20th century Latin America. I could certainly provide copy editing on a peninsular paper or a paper talking about even 19th century Latin America, or, even earlier than that. Because most of the sort of expertise I'm probably going to have. The only difference is, it does help, I think, to assign an associate editor to linguistics if they're a linguist, or to literatures and cultures if they are on that sort of track, just because the standards for articles are slightly different for the fields, right? They're all going to cover the same sort of basic stuff, but things about structure, it's actually going to be a little bit more formal in linguistics. Usually there's a little bit more of a social sciences format that gets followed. And so we certainly wouldn't want to put somebody who isn't familiar with that format in there. Okay, do we have any other questions? Well, thank you so much to everyone for attending. Again, please fill out that form. The copy editing process is going to be starting up shortly. We are just finishing up with peer review this month, so it may be maybe this month, maybe in September that we start copy editing, right? And remember that turnaround is about 3 weeks from when you receive a paper from Doaa, and so Doaa will be in touch hopefully very soon. So keep an eye on your emails, and keep in mind your own availability in the coming months. And we hope to be in communication with all of you throughout the fall. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.